Hi everyone, we're at the halfway mark of the semester. Yay! Welcome to week 8 of EDI 310, Establishing and Teaching Rules, Procedures, Social Norms, and Limits. After reading and viewing the materials this week, you should be able to define rules, procedures, and social norms. You should identify procedures that could be useful in a specific classroom context, and be able to discuss ways to establish social norms in a classroom. For this week's readings, your focus will be on Smith et al. 2015, Chapter 3, pages 52 through 81, and Thompson 2018, pages 355 through 371. There are also several videos embedded in this presentation for you to view that center on our topic. The core teaching practices that are connected to our week's topic are CTP number 5, Implementing Norms and Routines for Classroom Discourse and Work, and CTP number 8, Implementing Organizational Routines. You might be getting tired of these slides, but I do want to remind you there are these note sheets that help you keep track of your ideas and your thinking as you set up various pages on the classroom management plan. I would encourage you to pull these sheets and think about the questions as they relate to the readings and materials. And there's a few times throughout the presentation where we say stop and jot or quick write. And if you have these out and you can record these right in the note sheets, it will help make the process of creating your classroom management plan much easier at the end of the day, because you won't have to come back and do that. So before you read, let's surface our initial ideas or thinking or prior knowledge about this topic. It's always important to surface your students' initial thinking and prior knowledge. One, because it'll allow you to think about in a purposeful way what you know, so the new things, this research-based, evidence-based information you're going to be gaining can get hitched on to what you already know and think. Or when these two are at odds with each other and they don't align, so what you previously thought might be a misconception, you can actually confront that right away. There's a lot of information and research on how to get at misconceptions so they no longer stay in someone's brain, because at the end of a unit sometimes you can have an entire unit about a topic and then ask a question at the end, but a student's misconception is still there. So when you can first identify what you do know and understand, so you can wrestle with it in light of the new evidence, that's a more effective way to learn, basically. So that's why we put these before you read. It's not just to skip this. Really take some time to purposefully think about these 3 questions. So what's an effectively managed classroom? How do you create one? What's the difference between a rule and procedure? And then what kind of procedures might you teach in your future classroom? All right, once you've reflected on your initial thinking or prior knowledge, go ahead and read pages 52 through 81, and then continue to review the PowerPoint. This quote from Evertson and Emmer is a really good description of an effectively managed classroom. So it is one that runs smoothly with minimal confusion and downtime, and maximizes opportunities for student learning. It's not possible for a teacher to conduct instruction or for students to work productively if they have no guidelines for how to behave, when and how to move about the room, where to sit, when they may or may not interrupt the teacher, and the amount of noise that is acceptable. Some additional considerations when thinking about how to set up your classroom environment so that it is positive and supportive for your learners centers around the ideas of goals and having high and consistent expectations. So goals refer to targeted aspirations that can be short-term and long-term. When we have established goals, this can provide an opportunity for us to work towards something. This might mean that we need to tend to goal setting. It's important that you do have candid conversations with your learners in your classroom about goals and goal setting, and teach them strategies to engage in this work individually and as a class. Goals are important because they can influence the expectations for student behavior. You need to consider what kinds of goals you might have for your students, yourself, or your class, and how you're going to engage in this process with your students. Expectations are defined as desired behaviors or outcomes. So this is what you want yourself or your students to be able to do. So as a teacher, it's important that you have high and clear expectations for your students, yourself too, but in this context, we're really focusing on students. So generally speaking, it's best to make sure that all of your expectations are crystal clear for your students. So if a behavior expectation in your class is that students be respectful for adults, students, and themselves, you're going to need to have conversations about what that looks like, sounds like, and feels like in your classroom. What respect is it's a term that means different things to different people. So you need to be cautious and not assume that everybody understands what respect means, because they do, but they don't understand it the same way you might understand it. So define it. Ask students to list what it looks like and give examples of what this looks like. So there's a lot of different ways you can get to this in any given context. All right, and we also have to have conversations about all of these different terms. Respect was just one example. So you can have goals in place to achieve the expectations. So if you place goals, this is what the outcome will look like. But it's really important to make it part of your ongoing instruction. So you can't just set the goal and expect the expectations to take place. You need to nurture them. So that might mean direct, explicit instruction through different activities. So you can be practicing them, etc., or doing check-ins and checkouts with students, restorative circles. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do this, but it's important that you do it. Rules are part of our larger society, and our classroom's not really an exception. So they manifest in different types of ways in different classrooms, but it's first important to know what is a rule. So what does this term actually mean and refer to with regard to classroom management? So I use a good operating definition by Evertson, Emmer, and Worsham that states, a rule identifies general expectations or standards for behavior. Rules may indicate unacceptable behavior as well as expected appropriate behavior. And many teachers have a rule or two governing a specific behavior that could become an issue or that they want to prevent. So in a specific context or room, you might know, let's say you teach band, that students can't pack up their instrument before a certain time, or they're expected to have their instrument at a certain time. And that's a really pretty specific rule in that classroom. Or if a teacher has encountered certain things with students over several years, they might just know they need a rule for that. Or if there's new kinds of things that come up, like these TikTok challenges, and there's new problems that are emerging in your school or community, you might need to have a rule, and you might need to sometimes implement that rule mid-year when you start hearing about something like that. So again, there's all of these different ways rules may manifest themselves. But when you go into different classrooms, it's not uncommon to see classroom new rules or expectations for behavior posted somewhere, like on a poster, or usually on a poster. No one's going to keep them on the whiteboard because they disappear, but some kind of chart. And you might see some classrooms refer to the rules as norms. And I actually think of these things as two different things. So I stopped having classroom rules and I really only have, I have rules. Those are like the things I say. And then norms are what we create as a classroom. So depending on who you talk to, you might have two different definitions for rules and norms, but we'll actually talk about that more a little bit later. Okay, so here are some ideas about rule setting. It's not uncommon, even for classrooms with social contracts or norms where the students and teacher work together to create the expectations, kind of what I was talking about a second ago, and we will continue to talk about that more. But even in classrooms that have that, most teachers still have a few like ground rules, and I definitely had some ground rules. So whenever you're rule setting, there's a lot of different types of rules possible, but you want to be really intentional and selective about what rules or which rules are the most important and conducive to behavior and learning in your classroom. So you need to not be exhaustive. Don't think of every single thing that could possibly be done and make a rule about it, but instead think about categories of things and kind of like make a rule about that category of things. Because if there's too many, no one's going to remember them. So 3 to 6 rules is probably going to be just about right. So an example of what not to do, I had a teacher in my former district who she did this for several years, and eventually she gave it up. But she used to, at the start of the school year, put this giant sheet of poster paper or like butcher paper on the wall, and that's where they wrote the rules. Like, so in the first week or so they had the rules up. Then it was like an open wall that you could keep adding to. So whenever students felt they needed another rule, they would put it up there, but there was no process for this. It wasn't like, let's come to consensus. I think we need a rule here, which would have been an okay thing. Instead, they just walked up there and wrote down a rule. So if someone annoyed them, like, I can't even think of an example. There were some funny ones on there, but it became like this kind of venting wall where if a student was personally annoyed by another student, there was a rule up there about it. And yeah, that just, it's not effective. No one's going to remember that. Yeah, try not to do something like that. It's great for students to have input. So maybe if you did want this ongoing, like, this is a living document. If we need a new rule, we'll put one up there, but have a class discussion, come to consensus whether it deserves to be on the rule wall. Okay, so when you are engaging in rule setting, it's important that you're always explaining expectations. So that rule wall had no room for that, right? Sometimes you didn't even know a rule was on there, it just got written. So when you're explaining the expectations, these are the desired behaviors or outcomes. You need to unpack what a rule actually means. So you name the rule, you explain what's meant about the rule. So like, what does behavior look like regarding this particular rule? So all students are crystal clear on what each rule looks like. Give an example of, a scenario, like if a student is doing this, that's breaking the rule. If a student is doing this, that is following the rule. If there's some kind of gray area, it depends on the kind of rule you have, give that example too, and then explain how you feel about this. Is this following the rule or is this not following the rule? Okay. Finally, it's important that you reinforce rules across the year. You can't just make these rules or teach the rules on the first day and then expect students to remember them magically. So if you're not reinforcing a rule and you're letting behavior go, that's not really a rule anymore. So students aren't going to remember that it's a rule because you've never done anything about it. So if you see someone breaking a rule that is an absolute established rule you need to reinforce it. Otherwise, get rid of the rule. So if you're not prepared to reinforce a rule, don't make the rule. So the reason we have rules is that we have these structures in place for how we interact and be with each other. And by having this, it creates fairness and safety for students. So it's one of those things that is like, okay, so-and-so can do this, but the other person can't. If you're not enforcing the rules equally, that's also going to be inequitable. So again, not only having the rules, but enforcing them consistently is really important. So again, you need to follow up when rules or social norms are not followed or disrupted. So do this with affective language, restorative circles if it's gotten to a point where it's a bigger issue, or even have different kinds of consequences for not following certain rules. Again, this all depends on what the rule is and how it's going down over time. So as a teacher, you're going to need to use your best judgment how to do this, again, depending on your context. So my last little bit of advice, it's not really advice, it's kind of like you need to be aware of this, is you have to know your school's rules and procedures so you can align these to your own classroom rules and procedures. So you're going to be out of compliance if your rules and procedures don't align with the district. So if you have a rule that is in opposition to a rule that's already in the district handbook or your school building handbook, if there's a situation and you're doing something differently than what's in that handbook and that the district has established, and the situation is challenged, like by a parent or something, the school won't be able to support you because you're out of compliance with the legal policies and practices of the district. So to protect yourself, make sure you know what the district and or building rules are, and make sure your rules are not out of step with that. Some of you, I know from reading your teacher interviews, have seen social contract framework used in your own classroom setting to determine the rules or social norms of your learning space. Establishing social norms through a social contract is a more student-centered way to determine expectations for behaviors in a classroom. So we just defined rules and discussed rule setting, and I kind of alluded to this, but it's more teacher-centered than, so like the teacher is the person to determine the rules or expectations as well as the consequences. When we use social contracts, however, students are part of the process. So take 5 minutes and 10 seconds to view the video we have here on what social contracts are, how they can be used in classrooms with learners, and the benefits. Also, see the 2 images posted below the video as examples of what they look like when completed. Remember, there are different approaches to using social contracts, and there are different approaches to determining social norms. It's up to you to determine how this will be accomplished in your own future classroom. So here's an opportunity where you can go to your notes sheet provided for your classroom norms and procedures, and then spend 7 minutes or so jotting down ideas on how you're going to determine the rules or social norms in your classroom. So we have discussed rules, social norms, rule setting, and social contracts, all which center on the expectations for behavior. Now we're going to turn our attention to 2 additional important concepts, procedures and routines. Procedures explain how you want something done in your classroom, at school, or on the school bus. As a classroom teacher, it's your responsibility to teach your students all procedures. And to do this, you need to clearly state the procedure, demonstrate how it works, and then give students an opportunity to practice that procedure. And then you, the teacher, need to give feedback on how well they did to reinforce whether or not the procedure was done correctly. So every class should have procedures associated with how things get done in that particular setting. And we'll look at that again in just a second. But I'm going to leave it that for now. And routines what the students do automatically without prompting or supervision. It's really important we're actively teaching students the procedures, so eventually they internalize those procedures and they become a routine or something that's just done as part of the day without even thinking. So for example, if you want students to turn in homework, you're going to explain exactly what the process looks like. So do they need to submit it to a homework drawer, or do they just leave it on their desk, or do they they hold on to it and pass it all in at once? Do you have a designated person collect it? Do you have them upload it to your Google Classroom or Moodle or Canvas or something like that? So again, depending on your context, you need to show the procedure and then practice it and give feedback. Even when I was face to face, like I did not teach virtually when I was in the classroom. I left the classroom pre-COVID, but I was using Google Classroom, and I would have students capture images of their assignment, and I had to do a lot of practice with them to get good images. And I had them stop taking pictures, and I used a PDF scanner instead, so that made things a lot easier on my end. And then they would take that and upload it to Google Classroom, and that saved me a ton because, one, we just had them do it in class, so students didn't forget to turn it in. They still did, but not as much. And I didn't have to carry a stack of papers around, so that was really helpful. Also, they still had their stuff. They didn't have to turn it into me, so if they wanted to use it for extra learning or whatever we're doing, I didn't have to hurry up and think I need to, score it right away so I could get it back to them. I still want to give feedback to them quickly, but it wasn't a matter of pressure just to get it back to them. Not feedback-wise, just physically. Okay. So the larger point here, you need to determine what makes the most sense for you and your students, and you need to explain how the procedure works so they understand what's expected to them. Rosemary and Harry Wong are gurus in classroom management, and some of you mentioned their work in your teacher interviews too, which is really cool. But what they tell us is that effective teachers manage their classroom with procedures rather than discipline. So teachers need to have a strategic plan for how they want everything done in the classroom ahead of time, and then actively communicate and teach this to students so students know the procedures and they become routines. When you do this, you can focus more on teaching content than how to get basic things done, like turning in homework. So it also offsets disruptions in the classroom because they know what they're doing. You're not going to get the same questions over and over about the same thing because those procedures have been internalized into routines. I did mention consistency a little bit earlier, but this is a really important concept. So we're striving for classrooms to be predictable and stable. So you achieve this, or one way to achieve it, is by ensuring that we have rules and social norms that are taught and reinforced across the year. And another way is by actively teaching procedures to students so that procedures become positive, predictable, and stable routines, and then we can just get on with our teaching. So take a moment here to pause and consider, why might consistency be important? Bonus question, why might consistency be especially important for English language learners? And then finally, like a double bonus, why might this be especially important for students with exceptional needs? Because teaching procedures is so critically important for a positive classroom environment, I want to share this quick framework for how to teach procedures that comes from the work of Rosemary and Harry Wong. This is called 3 Steps to Teaching a Procedure: Teach, Rehearse, and Reinforce. And we explained it in one of the previous slides and talked about it at length, but this is so important, I wanted it to have its own slide as well. So again, you need to teach the procedure. So you state what it is, explain how it works, demonstrate or model it for your learners, and then students need the opportunity to practice or rehearse the procedure. So they need to actively do this, whatever the procedure is, under your supervision. And then the third step is where you provide different kinds of reinforcement and feedback. So, oh, I like how you're doing that. That is what we expected. Or, I would like for you to do this a little bit differently. This isn't exactly what the expectation is, etc. And depending on how well they're doing with the procedure, you very well might need to reteach, rehearse, practice, and reinforce it until it becomes habit or routine. So this isn't like teach, rehearse, reinforce once. This happens often until it becomes a routine. So you're going to need to think about ahead of time how you want students to do things, then how you're going to teach the procedure, how you're going to give them opportunities to rehearse and practice, and how you're going to build in purposely that reinforcement and feedback portion as they're practicing. That all of it is really important to plan ahead. Okay, so again, this is a simple framework, helps you teach procedures, teach, rehearse, reinforce. So here's another video, Teacher Toolkit, Teaching Procedures. This video walks you through one way a teacher teaches procedures to her middle school students. Also take 5 minutes to do a quick write here. So go to your note sheet provided for classroom norms and procedures, and then in your own words, explain procedures, what they are, why they're important for teaching and learning, how you might incorporate them, what you need to do with them, etc. And then remember, as you're doing this, this is for you to use for your classroom management plan. So don't write this in a generic way. Make it personalized to your own context or expected context. Okay, this is a final slide just in case people are still a little murky on what exactly a procedure is. So you know that it's defined as how we get things done in the classroom, but what are we talking about? Like what kinds of things? I gave a couple examples, but have you considered how you're going to do these things? Like how are you going to begin the class? How do you get students' attention if you need the whole class to like stop and get some direct instruction from you? How will they exchange papers, taking turns when speaking, although I had a separate set of norms for that, and that's a little bit different for discussion. But transitioning between tasks, what's your procedure for getting the class to be quiet? How do you dismiss them at the end of the period or day if you're elementary? How do you start the period or the day? What do students need to do when they need help or submit their homework or other classwork? What about sharpening pencils, distributing other materials, or getting equipment? So if you're in like a gym or science or music where you need other types of lab materials or equipment. Process for getting a drink or using the bathroom. Using the bathroom's a fun one in high school. Students always want to just take a walk, right? And oftentimes schools might have policies about this, but it's difficult. There's no way I can just tell a student, no, you don't have to go to the bathroom. But it does get annoying when the same kid goes to the bathroom every day. But again, there may be different reasons for that, right? So I didn't use this example, but one of my colleagues did, and it was a really great example, actually. So it was really annoying because her pencil sharpener was super loud, and inevitably, like at the worst times, someone would want to sharpen their pencil, and they'd be like, it's like an electric sharpener, and it really got annoying for her. So she had pencil cans. She had one can with sharp pencils and one with used pencils. So if they needed to sharpen their pencil, they just came and they swapped their pencils out. If they really had some kind of attachment to their own pencil, they could just come borrow that pencil and then sharpen their pencil later. But most kids, like, they had already taken a free pencil anyway, so they didn't mind swapping it. Because what she'd do, she'd like walk the hallways and pick up all the pencils that were just left lying around. So she had an unending supply of pencils that kids could use. It was actually really cool. In my classroom, a lot of teachers had problems with students using cell phones. I needed my students to use their cell phones because of the way I had them upload their work to Classroom. So they needed to be able to take pictures. I also had some iPads available for students that didn't have cell phones. But anyway, I didn't want them to always have their cell phone on them though, because it's super tempting to use it. So I had charging stations and I had a ton of them, like all around the room. So kids always needed a charge. They loved the fact that they could just charge their phone in my room, but the benefit for me is they're charging their phone, it's out of their reach. So they're going to need to be engaged, or at least not be engaged with their phone, because their phone's going to be plugged in somewhere else. The only downfall here is, and the first time I used this, I didn't really get this procedure down very well. Make sure if you do something like this, you tell your students they need to turn their ringer off before they plug it in, because sometimes that would be really annoying. We'd get these text beeps, so put it on silent before you plug it in. But there's lots of different examples, different procedures, and your teacher may have some great procedures you might steal. Otherwise, there's ideas that you've used in your own schooling that you thought was great. You can get these ideas anywhere. Okay, here's another moment to pause and reflect. Get out your notes page for this classroom management plan. And here you're going to identify 6 to 8 procedures that you're going to need to teach your students in your particular context. So they can be kind of generic that anyone might need, but definitely use some for your specific context. So I'm going to need some different procedures as a science teacher than a gym teacher might need. And as a secondary teacher, I'm going to need different procedures than an elementary teacher might need. So make sure your procedures aren't just generic, but they're definitely specific for your context. So what you're going to do is write each one down and then describe how you would teach the procedure. So not only what the procedure is, but how would you teach it? So if you're teaching 3rd grade, what would be the most pressing procedure to teach your students in order to get a certain thing done in your classroom? And then how would you teach it to them? What about 7th grade? 7th grade math, 11th grade history, band, gym, like no matter what your context is, what is your procedure, 6 to 8 of them, and how will you teach it? So again, this is connected to your classroom management plan. Use these note sheets to jot down the procedures. You name them in a sentence or so, describe how you're going to teach it. And then really, again, one more time, be selective about the areas. So your procedure should be areas that students really need to know and would make your classroom the most functioning, thriving place. So don't think about a procedure that students might need, once every few months. That's not going to really ever become a routine. Think of something that's a daily thing that will become a routine. Okay, after you're done, go through Thompson 355 to 377 for some additional ideas about procedures. Okay, so this slide has some resources that will help you set limits with students, particularly students who display some of the most challenging behaviors in class. So Thompson reminds us that when we do set limits with students, we're signaling to them that we care enough to have high standards for their behavior. Full disclosure, some students might not always see that in the moment, but hopefully down the road they might. We want to make sure, again, that it's a fair, balanced, and consistent learning experience for everyone in our classroom, for all of our students. And some students may have experienced difficulties, or like with other teachers or in school in the past in general, or they might just be having a rough day. So you need to really, again, always think about the context, think about the setting, but be as consistent as you can. So here's 2 videos to help you set limits with strong-willed children. Well, that's one. And then the other is just how to set limits in general. So both were created for parents actually, but there's connections to the classroom that are valid and work the same way. So I especially like the 15-second rule. My husband does not. I've even sent him this video, and he will talk to my 6-year-old and negotiate with him in the most ridiculous ways about the silliest things. So every year at this time, I resend it to him because it's an older video. He's seen it a few times now. All right, so assignment prep, what you need to be thinking about right now. You have your discussion board this week. So as always, make sure you're posting by Thursday, your original post around 300 words and 2 responses that are around 150 words. Original post Thursday, responses by Sunday. Midterm reflection. So there is a midterm reflection assignment, and that's an opportunity for you to reflect on what you've accomplished or not. So if you're still behind on certain things, this is a chance for you to own that and understand. This isn't for me to judge you, it's just for you to understand this is where you are. It's also an opportunity for me to better understand what I can do to support you. So use the link provided and then complete the reflection. Be honest. Again, all of this helps me help you, and then it also helps you help yourself too, right? So again, be reflective on the reflection. Student case study. You should be documenting and continuing to document the different behaviors on your anecdotal notes of observation page. You should be implementing, and then multiple times if possible, or if you can't implement, at minimum, recommend at least one strategy to your mentor teacher to prevent, respond to, or support the particular behavior you're studying or you've chosen to look at, and then take time to reflect on the effectiveness. So we're moving along in this process, and we should be moving on to being able to see, is this actually helping if you're able to implement? And then if it's just a recommendation, maybe you can reflect on how the mentor teacher responded. If the mentor teacher does implement, then you can look at the effectiveness as well. So finally, classroom management plan. So take a look at that pacing guide if you'd like to see about where you should be to not feel panicked at the end, and then continue to make progress. So look at the requirements for what we covered this week. So classroom rules and procedures. Look at the notes pages. Hopefully you've been recording in the notes pages as you went along with this presentation. And then think about rules, social norms. What are you going to have in the classroom? What consequences might be in place? How are you going to facilitate this process? What is the role of families? And so again, use the classroom rules and procedures notes form that's on Blackboard to guide you.